The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the book club show on Inspire 105.1 FM. My name is Imrana Mahmood and I have another wonderful show for you today. And I have a wonderful guest who I have actually had the pleasure of interviewing previously as well. So today on the book club show, we have Taher Adel. He is a Luton-based poet and spoken word artist. He has an MA in creative writing and poetry from the University of East Anglia. He was poet in residence for Wells Next the Sea in 2019. His poetry has also been published in Ambit, Smoke Magazine, The New European, Gulf Daily News, Glassworks Magazine, TEDx, Poetry London Magazine, and Poetry Salisbury Review. And he's also the author of The Names and The Divine Names. And The Divine Names is the amazing poetry collection that we will be talking about today. So I'm just going to go straight and welcome Taher on the show. So Assalamu alaikum, Taher.
Alaikum assalam. It's an honor to be here again discussing another book. I'm very excited.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time out, obviously to be talking about your work and obviously this new book that we've got, obviously the delight of discussing today. But let's go first. Obviously, it is Ramadan. We are well into Ramadan and in the last 10 days as well. And I guess I just wanted to know, how has your Ramadan been so far? Have you had a particular routine that you've been following? Maybe you had a particular intention at the start and, you know, just to kind of, get a feel for that.
When it comes to intentions and goals, I guess, for Ramadan, I treat it the same way I treat New Year's resolutions, in the sense that I try to not be as hopeful as the rest of humanity. I set my goals quite low in terms of expectation. It's only 30 days. So my overarching objective would be just to gain proximity with God, really, better than I have had in the 30 days prior to that. In terms of routine, there's a lot of sleeping involved. Don't like to admit it, but it does help me get over the line. But yeah, I have spent a lot of time reading and writing, and I found that's a great way to kind of work through the hours. And I'm writing a novel at the moment, which is quite different to poetry. So that's taking up a lot of my time in a very good way. And serving as a very good distraction as well.
Yeah, Masha, that's amazing. I'm so kind of excited to hear that. So that means, I know we've already just started this show, but I'll have to have you on again then once the novel is done, inshallah.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, okay, let's come to obviously your latest book, which is The Divine Names. Could you tell the listeners a little bit, I mean, obviously it's kind of in the title, but what the inspiration behind this particular, poetry collection and book is, and exactly what is it that readers can expect from it?
The inspiration, I'd say, is split into two parts. The first part, and I'm guessing the vast majority of the listeners probably don't follow me on Instagram, but the inception came, I'd say, 3 years ago when I developed a fascination with names in general, especially Arabic names and Arabic words. So I started exploring the definition and the etymology of Arabic words about 3 years ago in the form of English poetry. So English poetry in conversation with certain Arabic words. And that began with concepts like love and objects like the moon. And just a reminder for the listeners, there's about 28 names for the moon in Arabic, and over 30 names for love in Arabic. So that's where my inspiration stemmed from. And then eventually, as I was sharing this on Instagram, these became poetry collections in themselves. And then I went through kind of a personal spiritual dilemma where I decided what, since I'm learning about Arabic words and the divine names, the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are Arabic words, and they have their own definitions and etymology, and we all know, the definitions of the attributes themselves in basic form. But what if I have the same conversation that I'm having with these basic Arabic words and have them with the names of God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that was the core intention. The core intention wasn't to make this a body of work. Rather, it was for me to explore, and it lasted about 18 months, where I'd share a single name with a line or two as a poetic conversation. That resonated with a lot of resonated with me as well, because I was not only writing a single name for a single poem for a single name, but rather I'd end up writing about 5 or 6 for a single name, and then breaking it down to one, either as an amalgamation or just deleting, forming one, which I think would suit that particular name. So it eventually became a whole body of work inadvertently, and it followed with the whole cycle of previous work that I've done, and ended up becoming a manuscript in itself. Partly because a lot of people come to me saying, where can we find printed version of this, or where can we find the whole collection as a whole? So I felt like there was a need for it to be out there. And at one point I felt like it was time for it to be a printed book. But I wanted it to be different. So I approached the publishers in a different way. I wanted this to be a charity project, and I've got a few friends that work for a specific charity that I felt very close to, because I've seen the work on the ground and I've seen how it impacts people. So I decided, if I do end up publishing this book, I want the proceeds to go to a charity where it will end up becoming a sadaqah jariyah, not just because it's a beautiful work about God and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also because it's attributed to a charity. So I thought there was additional benefits and barakah that can come from that. So that's how it came to be, really.
That's, and it's, thank you so much. Such a beautiful kind of journey, actually, just to know, I guess, the intention behind it. And obviously you've mentioned the fact that the proceeds will go to charity, and obviously we know it's Ramadan, and, the big kind of drive to really, in terms of generosity and in terms of that giving is, really lovely to hear. And I think, just from listening to what you've said about that book that you've written, The Divine Names, and that kind of conversation in terms of the particular attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also, I guess I'm thinking, the power of language in obviously your work, not just this kind of body of work, but even your previous ones. How does all of that kind of play into your writing, the fact that you have access to language in terms of English and then obviously Arabic, and how does that, I guess, help in your writing and the way you go about it?
So recently, I don't know if it's true or not, but somebody shared on Instagram this kind of graphic where it shows the types, or the frontal lobes, or the other lobes of the brain, where different languages activated different parts of the brain and different bridges in the brain. And this could be all myths, and I could have got sucked into the whole aunties WhatsApp forward drive. But so apparently different languages activate different bridges in the brain, different parts of your creativity. Sometimes I've realized recently is, especially when the topic it surrounds an Arabic word or an Arabic concept or Islamic concept, I do think differently when it comes to the writing of the poetry, despite the poetry being in English. So maybe that all feeds into multiple parts of the brain combining and deciding to work together to produce work in a different way. I've always been fascinated about bilingual poets, bilingual artists, and I've always wanted to know the science behind it. But in terms of how it feeds into my faith, poetry written about my faith, I feel like I've always said this about poets that have faith-led inspiration and motivation. They've got a type of inspiration that not a lot of poets have, that have command over language, because having command over language is one thing, but having inspiration that can feed into it and inspire you to write does provide you with an additional platform. And that's always been the case when I've been amongst academic circles where there's other poets involved, and the main struggle for them is finding the inspiration. And I suppose having language and having faith as an additional bonus, it definitely helps as a writer, as a poet as well.
Yeah, and it's such a, kind of really interesting, I guess, dynamic, isn't it? The fact that having access to language, and like you said, how faith kind of plays a part of it. Because very early in your book, the divine names, I think it might be part of the introduction. You mentioned that this poetic exploration does not intend to attribute meaning nor specify that which is known, but rather it is a conversation of a poet with his Lord and Creator, which I thought was so wonderful. And I was reading it kind of gave me goosebumps, I guess. And I think, how would you say then, as a poet who's living in obviously the UK, but is delving into language in terms of, Arabic and English and having this kind of fusion almost, how is your work then received in different spaces, or when you're approaching maybe different publishers or at different events? I was kind of interested to know what that experience has been like for you.
The good thing about social media in 2023 is it allows everybody from all walks of life to follow you for different reasons, right? So my poetry is appreciated on various different levels. There's people that have no faith, that follow it for the pure joy of reading a poem put together in great language and poetic language. There's others that follow for faith reasons, that follow me for kind of a spiritual boost, although I don't claim to be a sage or anything close to that. But I do explore spirituality. I do explore religious elements, and that's something people find beneficial and can uplift them, probably more than it uplifts me. So that's a bonus in that sense. I've always said poetry in itself is a spiritual technology. In the same way, the best metaphor for this would be probably if you're in a home country, a hot country, let's say somewhere in the Arab world or somewhere in India or Pakistan, where we've got these kind of roofs. I don't know if you've seen, I'm trying to I'm struggling with words here. So normally there's a roof, and in this roof, it's like sunbathing heaven, except there's no chance of sunbathing because it's way too hot. But it's still access to the sun, and it's access to the kind of to the sky. And I see poetry in that sense, where you feel closer to the sun. Or closer to a divine source, but you're not really that close. It's almost the illusion of closeness, but that is enough to bring you closer in the moment. And that's why I've always said that's how I see poetry, as a spiritual technology that kind of elevates you and takes you closer, and takes others. So the whole beauty of poetry is that you could write something and instantly have that thought transfer to another's mind, and them to feel the same emotions, to feel the same proximity with a source that you are feeling in that moment. It's almost magical in that sense. And I've forgotten what the original question was.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
And I just remembered. So publishing. So that's an interesting part. So a lot of people come up to me with, you write about faith. How do you get published if you write about faith? And the sad answer is it's very, very difficult to be published, especially in this day and age, irrespective of faith, for faith-based poetry. And that's why I've decided to dissect my poetry into themes, and some of them are language-based, some of them are spirituality and faith and religion, and others are, tackling the concepts such as identity, mother tongues, and kind of isolated topics like that. And I found that I've had more luck in terms on the publishing front if I did kind of operate in that way. So my Islamic poetry was published by an Islamic publisher, and my kind of mainstream work has now been published by or is to be published in September by Burning Eye Books, which is kind of a mainstream poetry publisher. And that's the best way, unless you're exceptionally famous for other reasons or famous as a poet, then it's easier to get your work out irrespective of theme or irrespective of topic. But somebody like me who's, in the infancy of his journey, that would be the best way. And that's the struggle a lot of writers and poets have at the moment.
Yeah, and it's you've touched quite a lot there, which is amazing, because I like what you said about poetry as a spiritual technology, because you're right, it almost transports you into a completely different dimension, and there's this element of transcendence, in what you spoke about. And I did like the example of the idea that you're in this kind of courtyard and you've got this access to the sky, or that kind of divine source. But yeah, you're right, I think it's and it's really important, to acknowledge the fact that I guess there are challenges when it comes to maybe a person of faith or a person of color, trying to get their work out into the world, the creative world, or the art sector. But no, it's really promising to hear that obviously you've got, I guess, that kind of body work, which, for example, what you just said in terms of Burning Eye Books, I think is great. But you also have this, I guess, a different audience, depending on what the work is and what you're putting and what you're creating, which is, I guess that's something really good and something to aspire to. And I mean, so obviously the book itself, so the Divine Names, like you said, this was something maybe slightly different in terms of what your intention was behind it. Now, obviously you have collaborated with another artist on this book, which is Adel Abadi. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Because this isn't just a collection of, I say just, I don't mean it that way, because obviously it's poetry, it is beautiful, but it's also accompanied by some kind of really beautiful artwork. So could you give us an idea of how that collaboration has been? And obviously the slight drawback of radio is we're never able to see the actual physical book. So if you could explain, what the reader would, in terms of visually, what it might look like.
Yeah, sure. I'm very excited to explain this part, because it's, like you said, it's quite different to what I published before. It's quite different to a lot of poetry collections in the sense that it's not just a poet in conversation with a topic and theme, but also an artist. So Adel Abadi is a very popular kind of Islamic calligraphy artist, but his work is also quite unique in the sense that it's not just typical calligraphy led artwork, but also it's very visual. The colors are very vivid. I find it very difficult to describe his work, and I find it very difficult to describe any artwork, to be fair. But he's definitely an artist that people should, see. He's based in New York at the moment, but he's an expert, lived in London most of his life. So the collaboration started off with the intention to have an artist on board, not necessarily Adel Abadi. And I wanted the book to be a visual, I wanted the book to have a visual counterpart, something the readers could not just read and enjoy, but also enjoy from a visual aspect. That's always been something that I've aspired to outside of the publishing world as well. Outside of publishing books, I like to see poetry alongside art. It's just one of the things that I like to see. So I wanted somehow to have the names of God and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alongside poetry and art, and that was the challenge ahead of me at the time. This was about a year ago. And so I spoke to a friend, and obviously I mentioned the charity part. So initially, the primary objective was to publish a book, whether we find an artist or not, and for it to go down the avenue of the proceeds going to charity. But oddly enough, the charity that I was partnering up with had a connection to Adel Abidi, who was actually at the top of my list of artists that I actually wanted to collaborate with. So when I did mention his name, they're like, "It's your lucky day," as in we can contact him. So like, subhanAllah, as in my intention was to work with a charity, and then finding out that the same charity had a connection with the artist that was at the top of the list for me to collaborate on this project. So they did contact him, and he somehow found it a good enough project to work with, and he was more than happy to listen. So we had those initial conversations, and this is where it's tricky because especially working with artists in the past, you do not want to dictate to them what you want, because they would like to explore a topic or a theme themselves, and it kind of takes away their what's the best word for it? Autonomy or creative freedom, and they thrive on that creative freedom to explore and create pieces that are original. So that's what we've done. We went in with the idea of, here's the poetry, and the publisher was nice enough to even break down the poetry into themes at the time, so earth and heart and all these themes that she realized were common amongst a few of the names. So we broke that down and we provided that as a kind of canvas for Adel to go through. And he then had his own conversation with the names. And obviously producing 99 art pieces wasn't a feasible request on our part. So we didn't request 99, but we did decide to break it up into 9 art pieces. And then breaking up the 99 names into 9 themes, overarching themes, and then obviously having the 10th art piece being the cover itself. So there's 10, which is a very generous amount for an artist that probably produces about 10 in an entire year anyway. So he's produced this magnificent body of work, bespoke to this book, bespoke to the names of Allah, bespoke to the poetry as well. So he had multiple conversations, which was interesting, because he had the conversation with the poetry itself, an artistic conversation, and then a conversation with the themes that we've set. We broke them down, and then with the names themselves, and the overarching theme had to all blend in together. So it was very, very interesting to see how he worked, and we communicated throughout, and I was simply impressed with what came out. And I think everyone should have the chance to appreciate this, whether you're a fan of poetry or a fan of art, or simply want reminders, daily reminders about the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah, and I just, because I received the divine names, and obviously I had a look through, and both the poetry and the artwork is just kind of sublime, because it they both complement each other so much. And I think the idea that obviously this is dedicated to the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it makes it even more kind of profound, I think, for me. And myself, as somebody who, is just enjoys anything kind of creative, and especially poetry, to have this accompaniment, with the artworks. And, and it's true, the artworks are just amazing, and the way that they kind of feed into the words that obviously that you've written, and yeah, it's just absolutely wonderful to see. And there's so much I think that you can kind of delve into as a reader, because it's partly trying to explore the meaning behind the words, but then obviously having a look at the artworks and seeing, okay, what, so it's like having two artists for the price of one. It's amazing because you've got so much depth and so much, in the work itself. Now we are approaching the end of the first half of the show. So today we are talking to poet and writer Taher Adel about his new book, The Divine Names. And this is in collaboration with Adel Abadi. And, it's just one of those things that you need to get, I think, your hands on this book, inshallah. And obviously we'll talk a little bit more in the second half of the show how you can do that. But there'll be more questions about the book itself, about the journey. And we'll actually talk a little bit about some of the examples, and maybe we can pick some names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which are featured in this book and talk a little bit about that. But in the meantime, we are headed over to the break, and we will be back in a few moments. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Atif Nawaz. Listen to Inspire FM shows in your time by heading over to inspirefm.org or listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Book Club show on Inspire 105.1 FM. My name is Imrana Mahmood, and today we are talking to the wonderful writer and poet Taher Adel about his book, The Divine Names. In the first half of the show, we spoke to Taher a little bit just generally about his kind of goals, intentions for Ramadan and how the month has been for him so far. We then talked a little bit about the journey behind his book, The Divine Names, and his collaboration with artist Adel Abadi. So basically, The Divine Names, I was saying actually in the first half of the show, is an opportunity to really delve into the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a way which is really creative and artistic. Taher mentioned the idea that poetry is almost like this spiritual technology that can help us become closer to the divine source. Which I think was a beautiful way of kind of explaining it. This idea that, the power of language, the power of just any kind of visual kind of artwork can be something that transcends what we would normally, experience, and it becomes something which is very profound and meaningful. So what we're going to do in the second half of the show is to talk a little bit more about some of the content of the book itself, The Divine Names. So I'm going to start by asking, Taher, is there a particular divine name that you might, feel a bit more kind of closer to, or a divine name that you might call upon more often than maybe compared to others? So yeah, maybe if we just start with that.
I think that's a difficult question for any Muslim to answer. But there was an interesting anecdotal experience that has happened to me in the past 18 months while developing this body of work and having these conversations with the names. There was one particular name that didn't resonate as much as it did before this kind of experiment. But when I started analyzing and writing to it, it became a very quote unquote strong name for me to call upon. Ironically, it's the name Al-Mateen, which comes from strength. And the verse that I chose to write to it was, "Do not doubt the strength of your heart, for it can house the word of God, something mountains cannot." So that became a name that not just resonated, but provided my life with a semblance of strength, a reminder that God's strength lies in us all, and he provided us with a vessel that can contain him and contain the names and his words, whether they're the Quran or his names. And this vessel is strong enough to withhold and withstand this divine power. So where mountains previously, according to Quranic verses, would crumble if they were to accommodate for the Quran itself. So this kind of exploration, going back and forth with certain names, definitely provided me with a new set of favorite names, and there's a lot of them now. But previously, when people recall the names, they always, they mention Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the ones they've memorized, right? And it's become their favorite because it's at deeply embedded in their subconscious from childhood. But I think upon reflection, I think if a lot of people go down this route of reflecting and having their own conversations with the names, they'll realize maybe perhaps their favorite name isn't the same name they thought it was, and for different reasons. And the same names that provided them comfort, they might find an additional 3 or 4 that provide them with more comfort in that moment and in that phase of their life. And I think, beautiful thing about the attributes of God is they do help you in different phases of your life as well, where there's parts of where you're feeling low, phases in your life where you need that extra bit of strength, and you seek the stronger names of God. Or there's names where if you're, say, in a circumstance where you feel like you've been unjustly handled, perhaps you're in a war-torn country, then the words of that resemble vengeance and wrath are names that you could call upon. So there's a wide spectrum of meaning, etymology, and strength that comes from these names.
Yeah, and I think that's such a beautiful reminder, actually, the fact that, we can, through obviously the book that you have, the Divine Names, have or take opportunity and maybe carve out time to really sit with those names and see how obviously they kind of resonate, because I think you're right, in a different context, depending on the different experiences that we're having, it might be a different attribute each time that, really might, mean something, to us, or might bring us some sort of, like you said, comfort. So I think that's a kind of wonderful, actually, I probably will do the same. And obviously the fact that it's Ramadan, but even outside of Ramadan, this idea of, there'll be many people now in this month at this time, potentially sitting at Taqaf, whether it's in the masjid or at home, this idea of taking time out for this, seclusion, so we can really reflect, to be able to take time to really reflect on, the divine names is something which, inshallah will bring, a lot of benefit. Now, even, early on as part of the introduction in your book, you basically say the most beautiful names belong to Allah, so call on him by them, which is obviously from Surah Al-Araf. And then it says, I surrendered my pen and it returned with a remedy. I surrendered my words and they returned with your names. So where did that particular kind of, verse, come from? It's just a really beautiful way of, introducing us to the book, the Divine Names.
Yeah, it's for me, it was that particular verse came as kind of a summary of my 18-month experience of writing poetry to the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I felt like it was transformative for me. I wanted it to be transformative, so perhaps that did feed into that. I came into it with an open mind, and I love that the human experience also kind of fed into what I perceived to be the meaning of the names, and therefore I went back and forth deliberating on what the meaning to me is. We obviously know kind of, there's commentary on the names, there's scholarly commentary on the names, there's also Arabic foundations and etymology that explores the names as root words. So there's a ton of different analysis you could do on the names. But I think what drove me is my own human experience to find and connect with a certain name in a certain time, and then not just connect, but also analyze it through different means and go back to it in a week from now. So if there was one particular name that I felt, this is what I felt it means to me in poetic form, I kind of redrafted it a week later to see if it still meant that to me. And that's why, when I see this body of work, the first instinct is to encourage people to do something quite similar. In fact, to not use it as a basis, but rather as a kind of, I wouldn't say inspiration, but kind of a guide to how they should approach the names themselves, and see how they feel. But it all feeds back to the divine mixing with our human nature and human experience. And I think that's the beauty of these names, because it humanizes attributes which are ultimately beyond us and divine. And it's very hard to kind of articulate into words, yet they've been beautifully done, and they each possess an umbrella of feelings and emotions and potential inspiration that could just come out of a single name. And I think those are two great things that can be used. So not just the analysis of the Quran, but also the analysis of the names in our day-to-day life. And I think if we'd done that more often, we'd probably see some sort of spiritual development. And that's why I concluded or began the book with that verse, because that's how I felt at the end. I felt like I invested my time in something and I received something in return, which was beyond my imagination.
Absolutely. And I think, the reader, I think, would potentially feel, the same way reading the work. And also, this idea that we have obviously access to something like this in this kind of creative way, I think is really important as well. And I guess one of my kind of next questions was that, is there a particular kind of poem that you've written in the divine names and like an artwork that accompanies it, which is I don't want to say favorite necessarily, but something that maybe while you were in the process of creating this work that really resonated with you in particular, and what that process was like, obviously working with Adel Abdi as well.
The easy answer would be yes. I have always been fascinated by space and anything to do with space and the orbits and the stars and everything you can imagine. I grew up watching so that was always something that appealed to me. So there is a 4-page part of the book where it's just names that focus on the Earth as a planet, or as the names as part of this kind of otherworldly space related entity. And so I would say there's a few names that I like because of that, and because of the artwork that Adel did. The best example would be the name Dhul Jalali wal Ikram, and the poem that accompanies that would be, he who filled the sky with an eternity's worth of stars would not leave your heart empty. And there's a lot of poems like that look at the stars and the galaxies. Al-Badi', for instance, he uses the chosen to bridge heaven and earth, just as he uses dark matter to mesh galaxies together. So this whole section just looks at the stars and space and galaxies through the names and through the poetry as well. So I'm completely in love with this section. It's definitely my favorite section, and it's the section I go back and forth to. It's not necessarily the words that the names that resonate with me the most, but it's definitely a section that is my favorite. So another one would be the Ar-Rahman, which is a favorite name of many. But in this instance, I've chosen to describe it in a celestial manner. So it's when hearts remember him, they find rest. And that is why he's littered the sky with signs. And that alludes to the stars being signs. And that's what we see and read in the Quran as well. The stars being signs everywhere we go, for those that would like to understand. So that would be the favorite section, and I can go on about it forever.
No, and I know it's kind of almost unfair putting you on the spot, because if you were to ask me, I definitely wouldn't be able to, because I definitely have favorites everywhere. In each section, I'm like, but I think what was really interesting for me is somebody who's got like a background in kind of science and that kind of subject. There's obviously one particular artwork, which is obviously calligraphy that you can tell is meant to be, you know, about kind of, well, it's meant to look like lungs because we're talking about breath and life and,
Yep.
you know, and I think for me, Al-Wadud, you know, has been one of, a name that I've always really, I think, call upon a lot. So it was so lovely to see that accompanying artwork, and obviously again the words that you've written for Al Wadud. So I love that heaves before our breaths are known. I love that runs as we stroll. You know, it's just really. It's just, I don't know, I can't actually explain it, but it really is something that is lovely to see aesthetically. The fact that obviously what you get in terms of the book itself is you have the Arabic, you then have the transliteration of the divine name, and then obviously we have your words, but also then, you know, you have this beautiful artwork as well that helps you almost, I think, connect in a way that maybe you wouldn't just, you know, if it was just like on a blank page, if that makes sense. So there's so much going on, which I think is really, you know, it's just beautiful and it's, you know, so meaningful. So I think another question that I had was, if, you know, were then, you've just kind of explained some words that you really, that really meant a lot to you because of your own interests and stuff. Were there any particular ones that were maybe more difficult or, you know, slightly more challenging for you to write, and then, you know, and how maybe, I mean, obviously I know we're not, obviously Adel isn't here, but yeah, how that kind of process was and what maybe a challenge or some difficulty might have been.
Yeah, no, there definitely is. Some names were difficult because you couldn't simply write a one-liner about them, and you felt like you were doing it injustice. So the whole point of the project was to kind of concentrate the power of a name that is you know, is probably holds the weight of an ocean in a single line of poetry, which was definitely a difficult task in itself. So that was one challenge. And then the other challenges were the names themselves. Some names fed into poetry quite easily. Just describing the name was poetry in itself. Others had kind of a deeper meaning, or what we'd like to say, a few of the names had, you know, the direct etymology of the word would be negative connotations. So approaching those names in a way that didn't do a disservice, and kind of analyze the entire scope of the name. So what I learned is through reading the commentaries, so the official commentaries by scholars of centuries about the names themselves, is sometimes what we assume the meaning of a certain name to be isn't necessarily what it actually means. So there's obviously the Arabic root words that feed into the definition and etymology of a name, but there's also kind of a contextual definition that scholars have, you know, attributed to the names themselves, which are quite different. So understanding them was a challenge. Names like El-Mudil, which normally, as a direct translation, would come across as quite negative, but it's actually a name that is protective, so isn't seen as kind of an aggressive name, but rather a protective name. And when you see it in a protective light, it's very different. So yeah, it's a name that focuses on kind of reprimanding those that have ego and pride, and those who overstep in that regard. And the reason for that is a protective reason, to protect those that can't, are kind of, you know, done a misjustice by those that have expressed their ego and pride to overcome those that couldn't quite speak up at the time. So it's a lot of the names, like the Quranic verses, require context as well. So having those conversations in poetry with names that are heavily contextual was quite difficult. And it meant that I did need to approach kind of primary sources to ensure that I wasn't, you know, saying something that I shouldn't have been saying. But as I explained in the very beginning, it is a human experience, this book. A lot of it is not my interpretation, but rather a poet's conversation with how he's feeling in that moment, describing those names and what he understands in his limited nature as a limited human being with a limited human experience. But yeah, those were the challenges and the names that I found very difficult to kind of have that conversation. But I found the most difficult names are the names that are very common, that have so many ways of explaining. And then deciding to choose one line of poetry to describe that name and what it meant to me, that was almost disheartening, because I felt like I could write essays about that particular name. And then I wasn't allowed to, because I had to keep in with the body of work and ensure that it's consistent. But then there was a beauty to that, because each line of poetry didn't weigh too heavily. It flowed into one another, and it became kind of a complete project that way.
No, and I think, inshallah, it's something that, will be received well. Like you said, obviously it's a human endeavor, but, it is also, I guess, almost, there's an element of it being a gift, the fact that we're able to read the divine names. And obviously it's important that you've mentioned the fact that obviously each name and each attribute, there'll be obviously a context to it. And again, I think it's important to know, like, even for yourself, that you obviously then had to maybe go away and maybe do a little bit more, research. And we know even anything kind of attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran, we have tafsir, which is like so long on just maybe one ayah. So I can only imagine, the task that you had in trying to encapsulate a name in just a sentence or two. But like, alhamdulillah, and I think it's amazing that you've been able to do that. And so what is it, do you hope that a reader will have, like, the divine names? What benefit that you're hoping the reader will take from the book? And of course there'll be lots of benefits, for myself, I think there's so many. But is there a particular way that you want a reader to maybe engage with the book, and what benefit they might take from it?
Yeah, I think my objective would be achieved if I manage to create kind of a loose blueprint of how one should approach the names themselves, and how they should approach having kind of a connection with all the names, be it in the form of reading, or be it in the form of writing, or be it in the form of art. Just having a connection and using this book as a blueprint to how one person who's no better than anybody else has managed to have this conversation and inadvertently this connection with his Lord through the 99 names, in which he approached it through the guise of poetry. So that would be what I hope the readers will take from this, that, there isn't just the 10 names that we say in our prayers or and adars and memorize because they're very popular. There's also other names, and they also have different meanings. And what's interesting about the 99 names is there are names that are very similar. So, the Sabr and Sabur, like, there's different versions of the same root word, but they are different names, and they mean different things in different moments, and understanding what they could mean to you in those different moments is quite a beneficial thing to take in. And I learned that I wasn't aware of this, and I'm an Arabic speaker. So when I dived into this 18-month experiment, that's why I ended up learning is a lot of the names, despite their attributes being quite similar, aren't a repeat of one another, and they're not there just to emphasize on a specific attribute. And because that's what I thought initially. I thought, this attribute is so important that, God has chosen 3 or 4 names that are quite similar. But that isn't just the reason. There's a ton more reasons, and when you dive into kind of exploring these names, you understand them. So I would say, in terms of going back to what the reader should take from it is have that conversation, have that connection through the names, which is an additional bonus to what we have in our prayers, and with the Quran we have, and with the hadiths, and you've also got these names which are a beautiful corpus of work, which in itself unlimited amount of knowledge and benefit that one can, simply grasp just by having a conversation with it.
Absolutely, yeah. And so can you let us know where we're able to source the book from, the Divine Names, and how people can follow your work, just to end the show on?
Yep. So unfortunately, we were planning to launch the book at the end of Ramadan, but that does not look like it's going to happen. So we're hoping it potentially becomes a kind of an Eid gift for many of you. It will be available on Amazon. It will be available directly from the publisher, which is Sun Behind the Cloud Publishing. And from what I've seen with previous books, a lot of other online retailers will probably be stocking that and selling them. So online retailers, they will be made available, especially in the United Kingdom. That shouldn't be an issue, but Amazon primarily. So search the Divine Names, hopefully in 2 weeks time at most. So hopefully before 2 weeks, but if you do search the Divine Names, Taher Adel on Amazon, available to purchase. And I'm really excited for many people to get their hands on them.
Absolutely. And I think what you said about being an Eid gift would definitely be a wonderful Eid gift. So thank you so much for sharing that. And also, maybe just to end on the last point, which you wrote in terms of referencing the Quran, that in Surah Al-Isra verse 110, say, call upon Allah or call upon the most merciful. Whichever name you call, to him belong the best names. So that was Taher Adel talking about his book, The Divine Names, which you will be able to get your hands on, inshallah, very, very soon. So do keep a lookout for that. In the meantime, please do keep us in your du'as, especially in these last 10 days of Ramadan. And we will be back again very, very soon. So assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Why not tune in to our live stream at inspirefm.org and follow and subscribe to our social media platforms at InspireFM Luton.